The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. She put on a clean shift, a woolen, claret-colored skirt, threw a handkerchief over her head, glanced at herself in the mirror, and went out. The shadows hovered dove-gray over Tatarsk. A pale, impotent moon was rising beyond the Donside poplars, and a rippling ribbon of moonlight lay across the water. The herds were still returning from the steppe, and the cows were lowing as they wandered into their yards. She did not stop to milk her own cow, but drove the calf out of the stable and let it go to its mother. Then she went to the Myelyakovs' fence and found Darya just finishing milking the cow, turning with the pail in her hand to go towards the hut. Aksiniya called across the fence, "Darya? Who's that?" "It's me, Aksiniya. Come into my hut for a minute." "What do you want me for?" "I want you badly. Come in, for the love of Christ." "I'll strain this milk and then I'll come." "I'll be waiting for you in the yard." A few minutes later, Darya came out and found Aksiniya waiting for her by the Astachovs' wicket gate. She was surprised to see her attired in her holiday clothes. "You've dressed quickly, neighbor." "I haven't much to do now. Stepan's away. There's only one cow." "What did you want me for?" "Come into the hut for a little while." Aksiniya's voice trembled. Guessing the reason for the talk, Darya silently followed her into the kitchen. As soon as she entered, Aksiniya, without lighting a light, went straight to her chest, rummaged in it, and then, clutching Darya's hand in her own dry and burning hands, hurriedly slipped a ring on her finger. "What's this? Not a ring, surely." "You're not giving it to me?" Darya exclaimed. "Yes, it's gold. You keep it." "Well, thank you. What do you want me to do for it?" "Ask your Gregor to come to me." "The old game again?" Darya smiled inscrutably. "No, no. Oh, what are you thinking?" Aksiniya took alarm, and tears started to her eyes. "I want to talk to him about Stepan. He may be able to get him furlough." "But why didn't you come and see us? You could talk with him there if you have business with him," Darya sneered. No, Natalia might think it's awkward." "All right, I'll tell him. I don't care what he does." Gregor was finishing his supper. He had put down his spoon and was wiping his mustache with his hand. Feeling someone's foot touching his beneath the table, he looked up and saw Darya winking at him almost imperceptibly. "If she's after getting me to take Pyotr's place and says anything to me about it, I'll kill her. I'll take her into the threshing floor, tie her skirt above her head, and rip her up like a bitch," he thought disconnectedly. But rising from the table, he lit a cigarette and unhurriedly went out to the porch. Darya came out almost immediately after him. As she passed him in the porch, pressing close to him, she whispered, "Oh, you swine. Go along. She wants you." "Who?" Gregor breathed the question. "She." An hour later, when Natalia and the children were asleep, Gregor, his greatcoat fastened close around him, emerged with Aksiniya from the gate of the Astachovs' yard. They stood silent a moment in the dark side street, and went as silently into the steppe, which beckoned with its stillness, its darkness, and the intoxicating perfume of the young grass. Wrapping her in the edge of his greatcoat, Gregor pressed Aksiniya to him and felt her trembling, while her heart beat violently and spasmodically beneath her jacket. Chapter 16. Before his departure next day, Gregor had a brief scene with Natalia. She called him aside and asked him in a whisper, "Where did you go last night? Why were you so late home?" "Was it so late?" "Well, wasn't it? I woke up and heard the first cock crowing, and still you hadn't returned." "Kudinov was here. I had to see him to talk over military questions. They're not for your woman's mind." "But why didn't he come here to spend the night?" "He was in a hurry to get to Vyashenska." "Where did he stop?" "At the Obonshchikovs. It seems he's a distant relation of theirs." Natalia asked no further questions. She seemed half convinced, but her eyes did not reveal her true thoughts, and Griegor could not be sure whether she believed him or not. He ate a hurried breakfast while Panteleimon went out to saddle his horse. Crossing him and kissing him, Ilinichna whispered, "Don't forget God. Don't forget God, little son. We heard you'd cut down some sailors. Lord, Griegor, think what you're doing. Look what fine children you've got. And perhaps those you killed had children too. When you were a lad you were so gentle, but now all your kindness of heart has gone, and you're become a wolf. Listen to what your mother says, Griegor. Your life isn't charmed, and an evil sword will find your neck." Griegor smiled cheerlessly, kissed his mother's dry hand, and went to Natalia. She embraced him coldly and turned away. But he saw no tears, only bitterness and hidden anger in her eyes. He said goodbye to his children and went out. As he put his foot into the stirrup and held on to the horse's shaggy mane, he was thinking, "Well, life has taken a new turn, but my heart is still cold and empty. It's clear Aksenia can't fill that emptiness now." Without a look back to his family, gathered about the gate, he rode at a walking pace along the street. As he went past the Astachovs' hut, he glanced sidelong at the windows, and saw Aksenia at the last window of the front room. She smiled and waved an embroidered handkerchief to him, then abruptly crumpled it in her hand, and pressed it to her lips and to her eyes, darkened with the past sleepless night. He rode at a swift cavalry trot up the hill. At the top he saw 2 horsemen and a wagon slowly moving along the field track towards him. He recognized the riders as Antip Bryachovich and another young Cossack from the farther end of the village. Bringing home dead Cossacks, he guessed, as he saw the bullock wagon. As he approached the Cossacks, he asked, "Whom are you bringing home?" "Alexei Shamil, Ivan Tomilin, and Yakov Podkova." "Dead?" "Killed." "When?" "Yesterday at sundown." "Is the battery safe?" "Yes. The Reds surprised some of our batterymen in their quarters." Griegor removed his cap and slipped from his horse. The driver halted the bullocks. The dead Cossacks lay side by side in the bottom of the wagon, Alexei Shamil in the middle. His old blue shirt was flung open, the empty sleeve was put under his cloven head, and the stump of his arm, wrapped in a dirty rag, was pressed against his breast. In the dead grin of his toothless mouth, a savage frenzy was frozen stiff, but the glassy eyes stared with calm and seemingly sorrowful pensiveness at the blue sky, at the cloud floating over the steppe. Tomilin's face was unrecognizable. Indeed, there was no face, but a red, shapeless mass, split slantwise by a saber stroke. Yakov Podkova was a saffron yellow, and his head had been almost completely severed from the neck. The white bone of the sabered clavicle stuck out of the unbuttoned collar of his shirt, and across his brow ran a black bullet wound. Evidently one of the Red Army men had had pity on the dying Cossack's death throes and had shot him almost at point-blank range, for his face was burnt and spotted with black traces of gunpowder. "Well, brothers, let's remember our dead friends and smoke to the peace of their souls," Griegor proposed. Drawing aside, he loosened his horse's saddle girths, dropped the bit from its mouth, tied the reins to its left foreleg, and let it graze on the silky, arrowing growth of green. Antip and the other Cossacks, willingly dismounted, hobbled their horses and let them graze. The Cossacks lay down and smoked. Glancing at the shaggy bullocks straining after the grass, Griegor asked, "But how did Shamil come to his death?" "It was his own fault." "How?" "Well, it was like this. Yesterday at noon we went out on patrol duty. There were 14 of us, and Shamil among us. He rode along merrily, so he could have had no boding. He waved his stump about, dropped his reins on his saddle-bow, and remarked, 'When is our Griegor Pantelyevich going to come back? I'd like to have another drink and sing with him." He was singing all the way. We didn't see a sign of the Reds anywhere, and at last the sergeant said we could dismount and rest ourselves and our horses. So we dismounted and lay on the grass in a gully with a sentry on the hill. I saw Alexei loosening the saddle girths of his horse, and I said to him, "Alexei, you'd better not loosen those girths, in case we have to clear off in a hurry. And then how could you manage to tighten them again with your one hand?" But he snarled, "I'll manage quicker than you. Don't try to teach me, you baby." And he unfastened the girths and dropped the bit from his horse's mouth. We lay there smoking and talking and snoozing, but our sentry also dozed, lying under a bush. Suddenly I heard the snort of a horse some distance off. I didn't want to stir, but I got up all the same and went to the top of the hill, and there were the Reds riding straight towards us. I rushed down into the gully and shouted, "The Reds are coming, to horse!" They wouldn't believe me at first, but they heard their commander shouting an order. Our sergeant drew his sword and wanted us to attack, but there were only 14 of us, and half a squadron of them, with a machine gun, too. We galloped off, and they couldn't use their machine gun because of our position, so they began to fire with their rifles. But our horses were better than theirs, and we got well away. Then dropped off our horses and began to fire back at them. Only then did I notice Shamil wasn't with us. When we rushed to mount, he ran to his horse, got his sound hand to the saddle bow and one foot in the stirrup, but as he tried to mount, the saddle slipped under the horse's belly. Somehow the horse got away from him and came galloping after us with the saddle swinging under it, and Shamil was left alone with the Reds. And that's how Alexei asked for death. If he hadn't loosened the girths, he'd still be alive. They slashed him about so much that the blood poured out of him till you'd have thought a bullock had been slaughtered there. When we'd driven off the Reds, we went past the gully and picked him up. "Well, shall we be getting on?" the driver asked impatiently. Gregor said goodbye to the Cossacks and went to the wagon to take a last farewell of his dead fellow villagers. Only then did he notice that all three were barefoot, while 3 pairs of boots were placed at their feet. "Who took their boots off?" he demanded. "Our Cossacks did that, Gregor Pantelyevich. They all had good boots, and the company thought it better to take them off and give them to those who had old ones. So we took them off and put 3 pairs of old ones in their places." Gregor put his horse into a trot and kept up a steady pace almost all the way to Kargin. A gentle breeze ruffled the animal's mane. The long brown marmots ran across the yard, warningly whistling. Their sharp, anxious whistle was in strange harmony with the profound silence which dominated the steppe. Male bustards flew low over the rises at the roadside. One, sparkling like snow in the sunlight, its wings flapping swiftly, mounted into the zenith as though swimming in the azure expanse, its neck stretched out in its precipitant flight. It flew off about 200 yards and then sank, its wings fluttering still more swiftly. Close to the earth, against the green background of the grasses, its wings fluttered for the last time before it disappeared, engulfed in the sea of green. The challenging, passionate call of the male bustards was to be heard on all sides. In one spot, some few paces off the road, Gregor saw a perfect circle of earth over 3 feet in diameter, which had been beaten out by bustards fighting for a female. Not a blade of grass was to be seen in the circle, only a gray cloud of dust scarred with the traces of the birds' feet, and single stalks of wormwood and scrub, to which feathers were clinging. Not far from the spot, a gray female bustard started from her nest, and, not daring to take to wing, ran hurriedly on her little twinkling legs, her back hunched like an old woman's into the grass, and disappeared. Fructified by the spring, an invisible, almighty, and palpitant life was unfolding in the steppe. The grass was growing luxuriantly. In their secret steppe lairs, birds and animals were mating. The plowed lands wore a fine brush of innumerable young shoots. Only the last year's scrub was huddling drearily along the slopes of the mounds, standing sentinel over the steppe, seeking salvation from death by bowing close to the earth. But the fresh, vital breeze ruthlessly broke it from its withered roots and chased it off, driving it hither and thither over the living steppe. Griegor arrived at Kargin late in the afternoon. He took over the divisional command next morning, and despite the last instructions sent from the staff at Vyazhenska, after consultation with his chief of staff, he resolved on an offensive. The regiments were experiencing a severe shortage of ammunition. It was necessary to obtain it by an attack, capturing it from the Reds, and this was the prime cause for Griegor's decision. Towards evening, 1 foot and 3 mounted regiments were drawn into Kargin. Of the 22 machine guns in the division, it was decided to take only 6, as there were no cartridge belts for the others. The Cossack forces began their offensive the next morning. Griegor himself took command of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, sent mounted patrols ahead, and led the regiment swiftly towards the south, where, according to reports, 2 Red Army regiments were concentrated in readiness for an attack on the Cossacks. Some 2 miles outside Kargin, he was overtaken by a courier bringing a letter from Kudinov. The letter read, "The 2nd Sirdobsky Regiment has surrendered to us. All the soldiers have been disarmed. 20 of them who resisted have been killed. 4 field guns were surrendered. The accursed gunners fled with the locks. More than 200 shells and 9 machine guns. We shall distribute the Red soldiers among the companies and make them fight their own people. One thing I'd almost forgotten. 2 of your communist fellow villagers, Ivan Kotlyarov and Mishka Koshevoy, as well as many Yelanska communists, were captured. They're being driven along the road to Vyazhenska. How are things going with you? If you are in need of cartridges, send word by the courier, and we'll send 500. Kudinov." Griegor read the letter hastily, but when he came to the report of Ivan's and Mishka's capture, he shouted for his orderly. Prokhor Zhykov galloped up at once, but, noticing the expression on Griegor's face, in his alarm he even saluted. "Ryabchikov! Where's Ryabchikov?" Griegor shouted at him. "At the end of the column. Ride and fetch him here at once." Zhykov galloped off, and a minute or 2 later Ryabchikov trotted up to Griegor. "A letter from Vyazhenska?" he asked, as he noticed the courier at Griegor's side. "Yes," Griegor replied. "Take over command of the regiment and the division. I'm off." "Well, all right, but what's the hurry? What does the letter say? Who wrote? Kudinov?" "The Sirdobsky regiment has surrendered at Ust-Hapiersk." "Fine, so we still live. Going at once?" "At once." "Well, God be with you. When you return, you'll find us well advanced." Griegor furiously whipped up his horse. "I must see Mishka and Ivan alive. I must find out who killed Pyotra. I must save Ivan and Mishka from death. Must save them. There's blood between us, but after all, there's our old friendship," he was thinking as he galloped down the hill. Chapter 17. The morning after the surrender of the Sirdobsky regiment, the 25 captured communists marched out of Ust-Hapiersk, guarded by a strong convoy. There could be no thought of flight. Ivan Alexeyevich, limping in the middle of the prisoners, hatefully and yearningly stared at the faces of the Cossack escort and thought, "This is the end. Unless we get a trial, we're done for." Among the Cossacks, elderly, bearded men predominated. They were commanded by an aged old believer, a former sergeant in the Ataman regiment. As soon as the prisoners left Ust-Hapiersk, he gave orders that they were not to talk or smoke, nor to ask questions. "Say your prayers, you servants of Antichrist," he shouted at them, raising his pistol. "You're going to your death, and you shouldn't sin in your last hours. You devilish whoremongers, you've forgotten the Lord. You sold yourselves to the unclean one. You branded yourselves with the enemy's brand." There were only 2 communists of the Sirdobsky regiment among the prisoners. The remainder, with the exception of Ivan, were Russians from the Yelanska district, tall, healthy lads who had joined the Communist Party when the Soviet troops arrived in the area, and had served as militiamen or chairmen of the village revolutionary committees, and had fled to Ust-Hapiersk to join the Red Army when the revolt broke out. In peacetime, almost all of them had been craftsmen, carpenters, coopers, masons, bakers, shoemakers, and tailors. Not one of them seemed to be more than 35, the youngest some 20 years. Strong, sturdy, with great hands gnarled with physical labor, their outward appearance was in sharp distinction from the hunchbacked old Cossacks of the convoy. "Will they try us? What do you think?" one of the Yalanska communists walking at Ivan's side asked him. "I doubt it." "They'll kill us?" "I expect so." "But they don't shoot their prisoners. The Cossacks said so, don't you remember?" Ivan Alexeyevich was silent, but a spark of hope was kindled within him. "That's true," he thought. "They won't dare to shoot us. Their slogan was 'Down with the Commune,' with pillaging and shooting. They've not gone further than imprisoning, so the rumor goes. A whipping, and then prison. Well, that's nothing to be frightened of. We'll stay in prison until winter, and then there'll be a new rising in the Don. Our people will drive out the whites and release us." The hope kindled like a spark, and it faded like a spark. "No, they'll kill us. They're as savage as devils. Farewell, life. We didn't take the right road. We should have fought with them and had no pity on them. We shouldn't have spared them, but cut them down to the roots." He clenched his fists and shrugged his shoulders in impotent frenzy, and immediately stumbled, sent almost to the ground by a blow on his head from behind. "What are you clenching your fists for, you swine?" The sergeant in charge of the convoy thundered at him, riding at him with his horse. He struck Ivan with his whip, raising a wheal right across his face from the temple to the chin. "Whom are you beating?" "Hit me, Daddy. He's wounded. What are you striking him for?" one of the Yalanska men asked with quivering voice and an entreating smile. He stepped out of the crowd and put himself in front of Ivan. "There'll be enough for you, too. Beat them up, Cossacks. Beat the communists," the sergeant roared. His whiplash came down so hard on the man's thin shirt that the shreds of material shriveled like leaves in a fire, and the blood poured from the cut, wetting the shirt. Panting with anger, the sergeant drove the prisoners on with his horse and began to ply his whip ruthlessly. Again the lash descended on Ivan. Livid fires burned in his eyes, the earth swayed under his feet, and the green forest on the opposite bank of the river seemed to rock. He seized the stirrup and attempted to drag the sergeant out of his saddle, but a blow with the flat of a sword sent him headlong to the bitterly dusty ground, and the scorching blood poured out of his nose and ears. Driving them into a herd as though they were sheep, the escort beat them long and harshly. Lying on the ground, Ivan, as though in a dream, heard shouts, the hollow tramp of feet around him, the frenzied snorting of the horses. A clot of warm horse's sweat fell on his bare head, and somewhere very close, right above him, sounded a terrible spasmodic sobbing and a shout. "Swine! God damn you! Beating defenseless men, you—" A horse trod on Ivan's wounded leg, and the blunt points of the shoe pressed into the flesh of his calf. A moment later, a wet, heavy body, smelling of sweat and the salty scent of blood, crumbled down at his side, and Ivan heard the blood gurgling from the man's throat like liquid out of a bottle. When the Cossacks had finished beating them up, they drove them down to the river and made them wash their wounds. Standing knee-deep in the water, Ivan washed his burning abrasions and bruises, and, cupping his hands, eagerly drank the water, afraid he would not be allowed sufficient time to quench his insatiable thirst. As they approached the first village, one of the Cossacks rode off in advance, and hardly had the prisoners passed the first yard when a crowd, armed with forks, hoes, pikes, and crowbars, poured towards them. As soon as they saw the Cossacks and women, Ivan and the others realized that this was to be the manner of their death. "Let's say goodbye to one another, comrades," one of the communists exclaimed. After his wash in the dawn, Ivan Alexeyevich had grown stronger in spirit, and when he saw the Cossacks and women running towards him, he hurriedly took farewell of the comrades close to him, and said in an undertone, "Well, brothers, we knew how to fight. Now we must know how to die proudly. One thing we must remember to our last breath. One thought remains our comfort. They may stick us with their pikes, but they won't kill the Soviet regime with a pike. Communists, brothers, die bravely so that our enemies cannot laugh at us." After that first beating, all that happened seemed to be incidents in an oppressive dream. 20 miles they were driven through village after village, greeted at each by crowds of tormentors. The old men, women, and elder children beat them, spat in their blood-stained and swollen faces, threw stones and clods of hard earth, cast dust and ashes into their eyes. The women were especially brutal, resorting to the most cruel and ingenious tortures. Towards the end, the 25 men were almost unrecognizable as human beings. So monstrously disfigured were their bodies and faces, so covered were they with caking blue-black blood mingled with mud. At first, each of the 25 sought to get as far as possible from their escort, so as to avoid the blows. Each tried to push into the middle, and in consequence they huddled into a solid mass of bodies. But the Cossacks continually separated them, and compelled them to march in more open order. They lost all hope of the least protection from the beatings, and struggled along in a disorderly mob, having only the one tormenting desire, to force themselves on and not to fall. For if they had fallen, they could not have risen again. At first, each had covered his face with his hands, had impotently raised his palms to his eyes when the iron prongs of the forks or the blunt ends of the pikes had appeared before him. But at the last they were possessed by complete indifference to everything. At first they had raised prayers for mercy, mingled with groans and curses and a desperate animal roar born of unbearable pain. But by midday they went silently. Only one of them, a Yalanska man, the youngest of them all, a wag and the regiment favorite, groaned whenever a blow fell on his head. He shambled along with all his body quivering as though in a fever, dragging a leg smashed by a pole. At one village, one of the prisoners could bear no more. He cried out in a dreary, childish voice, tore open the collar of his shirt, and showed the Cossacks a little tarnished cross hanging from a string around his neck. "Comrades, I only joined the party recently. Have mercy. I believe in God. I've got 2 little children. Have pity. You've got children, too." "What comrades are we of yours? Hold your tongue," a hook-nosed old man told him. "So you've come to your senses now, have you? But when you shot our Cossacks, put them up against a wall, you didn't think of God then." Without waiting for a reply, he swung his pike and struck at the man's head. Nothing that his eyes saw and his ears heard made any impression on Ivan Alexeyevich, or arrested his attention even for a moment. His heart was like a stone, and only once did it awaken. At noon, accompanied by curses and blows, they entered a village and struggled along the street. Suddenly glancing to one side, Ivan noticed a child, some 7 years old, clinging to its mother's skirt, tears streaming down its face, and screaming, "Mummy, don't beat him! Oh, don't beat him! I'm sorry! I'm afraid! He's all blood!" The woman, who was aiming a pike at one of the prisoners, suddenly cried out, dropped her weapon, and, seizing the boy by the hand, fled into a side alley. Touched by the childish tears and troubled pity, tears welled into Ivan's eyes and streamed down his cheeks. He sobbed as he remembered his own little son and his wife, and out of the sudden memory was born the impatient wish that he might not die in their sight. Better earlier. They struggled along, hardly dragging their legs, swaying with weariness. Beyond the village there was a well in the steppe, and they asked the sergeant in charge for permission to drink. "There's no point in your drinking. We're late already. Get on," the sergeant shouted. but one of the convoys spoke up on their behalf. "Don't be so hard, Akim Sazonovich. They're men, like us." "How are they men? Communists aren't men, and don't try to teach me. Am I in charge, or are you?" "There are too many commanders like you. Come on, boys, and have a drink," the old Cossack said. He dismounted and drew up a pitcher of water from the well. The prisoners at once surrounded him, their fading eyes lit up, and 25 pairs of hands were stretched out to seize the pitcher. The old man hesitated, not knowing whom to allow to drink first. After an interminable second, he poured the water into the sunken drinking trough and stepped aside, crying, "Here, are you a lot of cattle? Take your turn." The water ran over the slimy, green, rotten bottom of the trough. The prisoners flung themselves towards it. His brows knitted with compassion, the old man drew up 11 pitchers of water, one after another, and filled the trough. Ivan went on his knees to drink. When he had quenched his thirst, he raised his head, and with extraordinary, almost blinding clarity, his eyes saw the frosty white pall of chalky dust on the Donside road, the blue of the farther hills, and above them, above the swiftly flowing, white-maned dawn, in the inaccessible azure vault of the sky, a little cloud. Winged on by the wind, it floated with a sparkling white sail towards the north, its opal shadow reflected in a distant bend of the river. The prisoners arrived at Tatarsk about 5 o'clock. The brief spring twilight was close at hand. The sun was sinking, its edge touching the border of the gray cloud masses in the west. The Tatarsk Cossack Infantry Company was sitting and standing in the shade of the great village granary. They were being transferred to the right bank of the Don to assist the Yalanska companies, who were having difficulty in withstanding the pressure of the Reds, and on their way to their new position the entire company had turned aside into the village to see their families and to replenish their stores of food. They were to have continued their march at once, but they heard that communist prisoners were being driven to Vyashenska, that Mishka Koshevoy and Ivan Alexeyevich were among them, and that they would soon be arriving in Tatarsk. So they decided to delay their departure. The Cossacks whose relations had been killed with Pyotr Melyakov in the battle outside Tatarsk were particularly insistent on waiting to see the prisoners. They stood talking languidly among themselves, their rifles piled against the granary wall, smoking, chewing sunflower seeds, and surrounded by women, old men, and children. All the village was in the street, and lads were posted on the roofs of the huts to watch for the coming of the prisoners. At last a boyish voice cried, "Here they come!" The soldiers hurriedly rose. The people surged and roared. There was the sound of scampering feet as the lads ran to meet the prisoners. "Our enemies are coming," one of the old men said. "Kill the devils! They killed our men!" another exclaimed. "We'll settle with Mishka Koshevoy and his friend." Darya Melyakov was standing at the side of Anikushka's wife. She was the first to recognize Ivan Alexeyevich among the herd of prisoners as they approached. "We've brought you one of your villagers. Paint yourselves in his blood, the son of a bitch. Give me a Christian kiss," the sergeant roared above the howl of shouts, women's shrieks, and weeping. He stretched out his hand and pointed at Ivan. "But where's the other? Where's Mishka Koshevoy?" Antip Brechovich made his way through the crowd, unslinging his rifle as he went. "There's only one of your men. There weren't any others. But one will be enough for you to tear to pieces," the sergeant replied, wiping the sweat from his face with a red handkerchief. The women's whistling and shrieking increased until it could rise no higher. Darya pushed her way towards the convoy and saw Ivan Alexeyevich, his face blue-black with bruises and blood, standing a few paces in front of her. The skin of his brow fluttered in shreds, and on the mass of mingled blood and hair on his scalp lay a pair of woolen gloves, which he had put there to protect the open wounds from the burning sun and the flies. The gloves had stuck to the wound, and so they remained on his head. He looked around with a hunted expression, seeking for, yet afraid of finding, his wife or his little son among the crowd. He turned to ask someone, anyone, to lead them away if they should happen to be present. He realized that he would get no farther than Tatarsk, that here he would die, and he did not want his family to see his death. Standing with huddled shoulders, he slowly and laboriously turned his head, his eyes wandering over the familiar faces of his fellow villagers. In not one face did he discern a trace of compassion or sympathy. All, both Cossacks and women, glowered at him evilly. Darya planted herself in front of him, panting with hatred, with pain, with the exhausting presentiment of something terrible which must be accomplished here, on this spot. She stared into his face, and could not tell whether he saw and recognized her or not. With the same anxious, agitated expression, Ivan continually shifted the stare of his one eye, the other was closed by a bruise, around the crowd. Suddenly his gaze rested on Darya, and he stumbled uncertainly forward, as though heavily intoxicated. His head was swimming with his terrible loss of blood. He was on the point of swooning. But the transitional state in which everything seems unreal, and the light is darkening in the eyes, troubled him, and with a supreme exertion of his will, he kept on his feet. A distant semblance of a smile hovered on his lips, and this ghost of a smile disturbed Darya, and made her heart beat fast and heavily, as though it were in her throat. Panting violently, her face turning paler and paler, she went right up to Ivan Alexeyevich. "Well, how are you, cousin?" she asked. The ringing, passionate timbre of her voice and the unusual intonation of her words hushed the roar of the crowd. In the silence, his toneless but firm reply was clearly audible. "And how are you, Cousin Darya? Tell your own cousin how you killed—" Darya choked and clutched at her breast, momentarily unable to go on. Her whisper, as she continued, was heard on the very edge of the crowd. "Your own cousin, my husband." "No, cousin, I didn't kill him." "Then who was it sent him out of this world?" Darya raised her voice. "Who was it? Well, tell me." "The Zamorsky regiment." "It was you. You killed him. The Cossacks said they saw you on the hill. You were riding a white horse. Do you deny that, you cur?" "I was in that battle." Ivan's left hand slowly rose to his head and fumbled with the gloves stuck to the wound. His voice had a perceptible note of doubt as he continued. "I was in that battle, but it wasn't I who killed your husband. It was Mikhail Sholokhov. He shot him. The blood of cousin Pyotr is not on my hands." "Then which of our villages did you kill, you enemy? Whose children did you leave orphans in this world?" Yakov Podkova's widow screamed piercingly from the crowd. Women began to sob hysterically, intensifying the already strained atmosphere. Afterwards, Darya said she could not remember how and whence the cavalry carbine came into her hands. Someone must have given it to her. But when the women's voices arose, she felt a strange object in her hands, and without looking at it, she felt that it was a rifle. At first, she seized it by the barrel in order to strike Ivan with the butt, but the gun sight stuck painfully into her palm, and she shifted her fingers, turned the rifle over, then threw it to her shoulder and even took aim at Ivan's left breast. She saw the Cossacks behind him run aside, laying bare the wall of the granary. She heard frightened shouts. "You're mad! Will you kill your own kinsman? Wait! Don't shoot!" Urged on by the bestial expectation of the crowd, by the desire to avenge her husband's death, and in part by the vain glory of suddenly revealing herself as different from the other women, of realizing that the Cossacks were staring at her in amazement and even fear as they awaited her next step, driven at a frightful speed towards a deed predetermined in the depths of her consciousness, yet not desired in her heart of hearts, she hesitated, cautiously groping at the trigger. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, even to herself, she strongly pressed it back. The recoil of the rifle threw her almost off her feet. The sound deafened her, but through the slits of her screwed-up eyes she saw Ivan's face change abruptly, terribly, and irrevocably, saw him throw out and then fold his hands as though about to dive from a great height into water, and then fall headlong, his head jerking at a feverish speed, his body quivering, the fingers of his outflung hands clawing the ground. Still not clearly realizing what she had done, Daria threw down the rifle, turned her back on the fallen man, and with a gesture unnatural in its ordinary simplicity, adjusted her kerchief and tucked her straying hair beneath it. "And he's still stirring," one of the Cossacks said, as with extraordinary deference he stepped aside to let her pass. Not understanding what was said, nor of whom it was said, she looked round and heard a deep, monotonous, protracted groan that seemed to come not from a man's throat, but from his very heart. The groan passed into a death rattle. Only then did she realize that it was Ivan Alexeyevich who had groaned, who had received death at her hand. Swiftly and lightly she strode past the granary in the direction of the square. Only a few eyes turned to follow her, for the crowd's attention had passed to Antip Pryakhovich. As though on the parade ground, he ran swiftly on his toes toward Ivan Alexeyevich, for some reason hiding a bayonet behind his back. With deliberate and calculated movements, he squatted on his heels, directed the point of the bayonet into Ivan's breast, and quietly said, "Well, now die, Kotlyarov." With all his strength, he pressed on the bayonet handle. Painful and slow was Ivan's death. Unwilling was life to abandon his healthy, muscular body. Even after the third blow of the bayonet, he still gaped, and a drearily hoarse "ah, ah, ah" came from between his blood-stained teeth. "Hey, get away to the devil," the convoy sergeant said, thrusting Antip off. The sergeant raised his revolver and took businesslike aim at Ivan. His shot acted as the signal for the Cossacks to fling themselves on the prisoners. The hunted men broke and scattered in confusion. The dry and curt sound of rifle shots mingled with the shouts. Griegor Melyukov galloped into Tatarsk less than half an hour later. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. Griegor Melyukov galloped into Tatarsk less than half an hour later. He had ridden his own horse to death, and as he was crossing the steppe from Ust-Hapiersk, it had dropped on the road. Dragging the saddle to the nearest village, he had borrowed a miserable nag, but he arrived too late. The Tatarsk infantry company had already disappeared beyond the hill on its way to the bounds of the Ust-Hapiersk district, and the village was quiet and deserted. Night was spreading its somber pall over the surrounding hills. Griegor rode into his yard, dismounted, and entered the hut. There was no light in the kitchen. In the heavy shadows, the mosquitoes were buzzing. The icons in the corner glimmered faintly. Drinking in the familiar, disturbing scent of his home, Griegor called, "Anyone at home? Mother? Dunya?" "Griegor, is that you?" Dunya's voice came from the front room. He heard the slapping of bare feet, and his sister's white figure, hurriedly fastening the belt of her underskirt, appeared in the doorway. "Why have you gone to bed so early?" he asked her. "Where's Mother?" "There's been—" Dunya lapsed into silence, and Griegor heard her breathing hurriedly and agitatedly. "What's the matter? How long is it since the prisoners were here?" "They've killed them." "What?" "The Cossacks killed them. Oh, Grisha, our Daria, the accursed carrion." Indignant tears sounded in Dunya's voice. "She killed Ivan Alexeyevich herself, shot him." "What are you babbling?" Griegor shouted, fearfully seizing his sister by the collar of her shirt. The tears glittered in Dunya's eyes, and by the terror frozen in their pupils, he realized that his ears had not deceived him. "And Mishka Koshevoy? Stockman? They weren't among the prisoners." Briefly, brokenly, she told him of the execution of the Red prisoners and of Daria's deed. "Mama was afraid to stay the night in the same hut with her, so she went to sleep with neighbors. she finished. "And Darya came home drunk as a beast. She's asleep now." "Where?" "In the granary." Griegor turned and went out, strode across the yard, and threw open the granary door. Her skirt shamelessly pulled up around her, Darya was sleeping on the floor. Her slender arms were flung out, her right cheek glistened with spittle, the smell of homemade vodka came strongly from her open mouth. She lay breathing heavily and stertorously, her head tucked in awkwardly, her left cheek pressed against the floor. Never before had Griegor felt such a savage desire to use his saber. For several seconds he stood over Darya, groaning and swaying, grinding his teeth, staring with invincible loathing and contempt at the body lying beneath him. Then he took a step forward and set the iron-shod heel of his boot on her face, pressing with all the weight of his body on his heel. As he felt the nose cracking and the cheek slipping beneath his boot, he roared hoarsely, "You poisonous reptile!" Darya groaned drunkenly and muttered something. Griegor clutched his head between his hands and ran out into the yard. He rode back to the front the same night, not stopping even to see his mother. Chapter 18. About noon one day early in May, an aeroplane appeared above the village of Singin in Vyshchenska district. Their attention attracted by the deep roar of the engines, the children, women, and old men ran out of their huts, craning their necks, setting their palms to their eyes, and staring as the aeroplane circled in the misty sky above them. The roar of the engine sounded louder and heavier as the machine slowly descended, seeking a smooth area on which to alight in the pasture land outside the village. "They'll be dropping bombs in a minute! Look out!" some fertile-brained old granddad shouted in terror. The crowd gathered at the street corner, scattered like water drops. The women dragged off their howling children. The old men jumped across the fences and fled into the orchards. Only one old woman was left at the corner. She would have run too, but either her legs failed her in her terror, or she stumbled over a cat, for she fell. And where she fell, she remained lying, shamelessly kicking out her fat legs and quietly calling, "Oh, save me! Oh, death! Death!" Nobody returned to save the old woman. Roaring frightfully, the aeroplane passed right over the granary, and for a second the shadow of its wings blotted out the daylight from the mortally terrified old woman's eyes. At that moment, half dead with fear, hearing and feeling nothing either around her or beneath her, she wet herself like a child. Naturally, she was too far gone to notice that the aeroplane had landed in the pasture lands, and that two men in black leather jerkins emerged from the cockpit. They turned irresolutely towards the village, looking cautiously about them. But her husband, who had hidden himself in the orchard, was a brave old fellow. Although his heart was pumping away like that of a sparrow in the hand, he was bold enough to watch what happened. And it was he who recognized one of the two men as an officer, Pyotr Bogatyrev, the son of a regimental comrade of his. Pyotr, who was first cousin to Griegor Bogatyrev, the commander of the insurgent special brigade, had retreated with the whites to the Donets. But there was no doubt that it was he. The old man stared inquisitively for a moment, sitting up like a hare with arms hanging. Finally convinced that it was Pyotr Bogatyrev slowly coming towards him, he rose to his feet and tried whether they would hold him up. His legs held him up splendidly, and only trembled a little, so the old man slowly emerged from the orchard. He did not go to his old wife, still lying in the dust, but walked straight towards Pyotr and his companion, removing his Cossack cap as he went. Pyotr Bogatyrev recognized him and welcomed him with a wave of the hand and a smile. "Tell me, is it really you, Pyotr Bogatyrev?" the old man asked. "Yes, it's me, Grandad. So the Lord has granted me in my old age to see a flying machine. It surely did frighten us. There aren't any Reds in the district, are there, Daddy?" "No, my boy. They've been driven somewhere beyond the Chira, into the Ukrainian districts." And have our Singin Cossacks risen too? They rose all right, but many of them have been brought back. How? I mean they've been killed. Ah. And my family, my father, are they well? All alive and well. But have you come from the Donets? You didn't see my son Tikhon there, did you? Yes, and I've brought you a greeting from him. Well, Daddy, guard our machine so that the boys don't get playing about with it. I'm going home. He turned to the other man. Come along. Pyotr and his companion went off into the village, and from the orchards, from sheds, cellars, and every conceivable nook and cranny, the terrified people emerged. They surrounded the aeroplane, which still breathed out a smell of gasoline and oil. Its wings had been shot through in many places with bullets and shrapnel. It stood silent and hot like a hard-driven horse. The old man, who had been the first to recognize Pyotr Bogatyrev, ran to the alley where his wife had fallen in order to rejoice her with news of their son, but she was not to be seen. She had picked herself up and run into the hut to change into her best clothes. The old man went into the hut, found her, and shouted, "Pyotr Bogatyryev's come home. He's brought us a greeting from Tikhon." Then, noticing that his old wife was changing her clothes, and not knowing the reason, his wrath boiled up, and he roared at her, "What are you dressing yourself up for, you old crone? Nobody's going to look at you, you withered devil." The elders of the village quickly assembled in the hut of Pyotr Bogatyryev's father. Each of them removed his cap at the threshold, crossed himself before the icons, and sat down briskly on the bench, leaning on his staff. Between sips at a glass of cold milk, Pyotr Bogatyryev told how he had flown to the district on the instructions of the Don government at Novocherkass in order to establish contact with the insurgent Cossacks and to assist them in their struggle against the Reds by supplying ammunition and officers by aeroplane. He informed them that before long the Donets army would begin an offensive along the entire front and would join forces with the insurgents' army. He reproved the old men for not having a better influence over the young Cossacks who had abandoned the front and had let the Reds set foot on the Don land, and ended, "But since you've thought better of it and driven the Soviet government out of the district, the Don government will pardon you everything." "But even now, Pyotr Grigorovich, we've got a Soviet government, only without the communists," one of the old men told him irresolutely. "Our flag isn't the three-colored one, but red and white." "And our youngsters, the swine, still call one another comrade when they meet," another added. Pyotr Bogatyryev smiled in his mustache, and, screwing up his blue eyes humorously, replied, "Your Soviet government is like ice in spring. Let the sun warm it a little, and it'll melt away. But we'll settle with those who organized the desertion from the front as soon as we return from the Donets." "That's right. Cut them down, the devils. Death to all of them, to the last man," the old men roared in delighted approval. Towards evening, the commander of the insurgents, Kudinov, and his chief of staff, Safonov, who had been informed by courier of the aeroplane's arrival, galloped into Singin in a tarantass drawn by a troika of horses. Rejoiced beyond measure by the news, they ran into Bogatyryev's hut without stopping to remove the mud from their boots. At a secret conference of the Supreme Command of the insurgent forces, held after Kudinov's return to Vyashenska, it was decided to ask the Don government for assistance. Kudinov was instructed to write a letter declaring the insurgents' repentance and regret for having entered into negotiations with the Reds and abandoning the front at the end of 1918. In his letter, Kudinov promised that the fight against the Bolsheviks would be carried on vigorously to a victorious conclusion, and asked for staff officers and cartridges to be sent by aeroplane across the front. Pyotr Bogatyryev remained behind with the insurgents, and the pilot carried Kudinov's letter back to Novocherkass. Thenceforth, close contact was established between the Don government and the insurgent forces. Almost daily, aeroplanes flew from beyond the Donets, bringing officers, cartridges, and small quantities of shells for light field guns. The pilots also brought letters from the Upper Don Cossacks who had retreated with the Don army, and carried back answers from their families. Guided by the situation on the Donetsk front and by his own strategic necessities, the commander of the Don White Army, General Sidorin, sent Kudinov plans of operations, instructions, reports, and information of the Red Army divisions being transferred to the insurgent front. Kudinov informed only a chosen few about his correspondence with Sidorin, keeping it a close secret from all others. Part 3. Retreat and Advance. Chapter 1. By May 1919, the Soviet government was beginning to realize that the rebellion in the Don province was serious and called for drastic suppression, and the Red forces opposing the insurgents were considerably increased. Now, for the first time, Grigory Melyukov and his division felt all the might of a formidable attack, and they were compelled to retreat northward towards the Don, yielding village after village. Grigory put up a stubborn resistance around Kargin, but under the pressure of the enemy's superior strength, he was forced not only to surrender Kargin, but to ask Kudinov for reinforcements. In response to his appeal, Medvedev, the commander of the 3rd Division, transferred 8 cavalry squadrons to his command. Grigory was surprised to see how well these squadrons were equipped. All had ample reserves of cartridges. All were in new clothing and good boots taken from Red Army prisoners. Despite the heat, many of them were wearing leather jerkins, and almost every man had a pistol or field glasses. With the aid of these reinforcements, the advance of the Red Army was arrested for a time. Grigory decided to take advantage of the opportunity, and in answer to Kudinov's incessant requests to ride into Vyazhenska for a conference. He arrived at Vyazhenska early in the morning. The Don floodwater was beginning to abate. The air was filled with the cloyingly sweet, glutinous scent of the poplars. Along the river, the sappy, dark green leaves of the oaks were rustling dreamily. The bared, earthy rises were steaming, and a slender, prickly green was showing on them. The hollows still gleamed with stagnant water, and above it gnats were swarming. Grigory found Kudinov sitting with a serious and preoccupied face, intent on a strange task. As Grigory quietly entered, he did not look up, but continued to pull the legs off a large, horribly green fly. He pulled off a leg, then closed his great dry palm around the fly, and set it to his ear, listening concentratedly to the excited buzzing of the imprisoned insect. Suddenly noticing Grigory with a gesture of revulsion and irritation, he threw the fly under the table, wiped his palm on his trousers, and wearily leaned against the shiny back of his chair. "Sit down, Grigory Pantelyevich," he said. "How are you, Chief?" Grigory inquired. Well as can be expected. How are things going with you? So they're driving you back?" "All along the line." "Did you hold them at the Chira?" "Not for long, but Medvedev's reinforcements saved the situation." "This is the position, Melyukov." Kudinov took the gray leather of his Caucasian belt in his hands, and, staring with studied attention at the tarnished silver of the buckle, he sighed. "So far as we can see, our affairs will get still worse before they're better. Something is happening on the Donetsk. Either our friends there are breaking through the Red front and pushing them back onto us, or else the Reds have realized that we're the cause of all their present troubles and are trying to close us in a vice." "And what news is there from the cadets? What reports did they send by the last aeroplane?" "Nothing special. They don't tell you or me their plans, brother. They're trying to break through the Red front and come to our help. They've promised us assistance, but it doesn't always come. It's not an easy matter to break through a front, and you and I know what strength the Reds have got on the Donetsk. We are living in the dark, and we can't see farther than the ends of our noses." "Well, what did you want to talk to me about? How about this conference you called me in for?" Grigory asked, yawning with boredom. He was not particularly concerned for the result of the rising. It no longer seemed to trouble him. Like a horse dragging a roller around a threshing floor, His thoughts had circled day after day around the one problem, until at last he had mentally shrugged his shoulders. There'll be no making peace with the Soviets now, that's certain. We've shed too much of their blood. But we let them come into the Don province, and although the cadet government is saying smooth words to us now, they'll be making our fur fly later on. Damn it, whichever way it ends, it'll be well ended. Still not looking Gregor in the eyes, Kudinov unfolded a map and remarked, "We've had a conference here in your absence and have decided—" "Whom did you have the conference with? With the prince?" Gregor interrupted him, recalling the council of war that had taken place in this same room in the winter, with the Caucasian general present. Kudinov frowned, and his face darkened. "He's no longer here," he replied. "How is that?" Gregor asked with sudden interest. "Haven't I ever told you? Comrade Georgidze was killed." "How can you call him comrade? He was a comrade only so long as he was wearing a sheepskin jacket. But if we'd joined forces with the cadets, which God forbid, and he'd been still alive, he'd have been greasing his mustache the very same day, and he wouldn't have offered you his hand, but his little finger, like that." Gregor stuck out his dirty, swarthy finger and laughed, baring his teeth. Kudinov still frowned, and open dissatisfaction, irritation, and restrained annoyance were expressed in his glance and his voice. "There's nothing to laugh about," he snarled. "Don't laugh at another man's death." Gregor smilingly replied, "I've no pity to spare for that white-faced and white-handed colonel." "Well, he's been killed. In a battle? It's difficult to tell. It's a strange story, and the truth isn't easy to get at. On my orders, he was attached to the transport. It appears he didn't get on well with the Cossacks. There was a fight going on close to Dudorevka, and the transport with which he was riding was about 2 miles behind the firing line. He was sitting on a wagon, and a stray bullet hit him and bowled him into the sand. So the Cossacks said. They left him unburied. The Cossacks must have killed him, the swine. And they did well to kill him. Enough of that talk. It will get you into trouble. Don't get angry. I was joking. Another time, keep your stupid jokes to yourself. So according to you, the officers ought to be killed. Down with the epaulets again. Isn't it time you found some sense, Gregor? Get on with your story. There's no more to tell. I guessed the Cossacks had killed him and went out and had a heart-to-heart talk with them. They denied that they'd killed him, but I could see by their eyes that they were lying. But what are you to do with them? You could piss in front of them, and they'd swear it was God's own dew falling. Kudinov crushed the belt in his hands and flushed. They killed the one man who knew the art of war. And now, without him, I feel as though I'd lost my right hand. Who will draw up plans for us now? We can talk away here, but as soon as it's a question of strategy, we're out of our depth. I'm thankful Pyotr Bogatyrev arrived, or I'd have had no one to exchange a word with. And now I'm come to the real point. If our people don't break through the front on the Donets, we shan't be able to hold out. So we've decided, as I've already said, to throw the whole army of 30,000 into an attempt to break through. If you're beaten back, then retreat to the Don. We'll clear the right bank from Ust-Hapiersk to Kazanska, dig trenches, and defend ourselves. He was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. "Come in!" he shouted. The commander of the 6th Special Brigade, Gregor Bogatyrev, entered. His strong, red face was glistening with sweat. His faded auburn eyebrows were knitted angrily. Without removing his cap, he sat down at the table. "What have you come for?" Kudinov asked, staring at Bogatyrev with a restrained smile. "Give us cartridges," Bogatyrev demanded. "We've given you some. How many more do you want? Do you think I've got a cartridge factory here? And what did you give us? 1 cartridge for each man? They're firing at us with their machine guns, and all we can do is bow our backs and hide ourselves. Do you call that war?" "Wait a bit, Bogatyrev. We're discussing important matters," Kudinov said. As Bogatyrev rose to go out, he added, "But don't go. We've no secrets from you." He turned to Gregor. "Well then, Melyakov, if we can't hold out even on this side, then we'll try to break through. We'll leave all who are not in the army, leave all our baggage, put the infantry on wagons, take 3 batteries with us, and march to the Donets. We want to put you at the head. You won't object? It's all one to me. But how about our families? Our girls, our wives, the old men will all be lost. What is to be? Better they should go under than that we all should. Bogatyrev smiled and shook his head. And by next year, how many peasants will our women have given birth to? He remarked. You won't be able to count them. The Reds are hungry for women now. The other day we retreated from a village and everybody cleared out with us, only one young wife staying behind. In the morning we saw her crawling towards us like a crab. The comrades had abused her until she could no longer stand on her feet. Kudinov's mouth dropped at the corners. Griagor turned to go out, but before going he asked Kudinov, In the event of my bringing the whole division to Bazki, will there be anything for us to cross the river to Vyashenska on? What an idea! The cavalry can swim their horses across the Don, surely. Who ever heard of cavalry being carried across a river? But I haven't many Don-side men, you know that, and the Cossacks from the Chira are not good at swimming. They've spent all their lives in the steppe, and where can they swim there? They'll manage on their horses. They had to do it at maneuvers and in the German war. I'm talking about the infantry. There's the ferry, and we'll get boats ready, don't be afraid. The people will be coming too. I know. You provide means of crossing for everybody, or I'll wring the soul out of you when I arrive. It won't be any joke if the people get left on the wrong side of the river. All right, I'll see to it. And what about the guns? Blow up the mortars, but bring the field guns here. We'll get boats ready big enough to bring the batteries over to this side. Since the battle in which he had killed the sailors, Griagor had lived continually in a state of cold, numb indifference. He went about with head hanging despondently, without a smile. For a whole day, pain and sorrow for the dead Ivan Alexeyevich had troubled him. Then that, too, had passed. The only thing left to him in life, or so it seemed to him, was his passion for Aksenia, which had returned with new and unbearable strength. She alone beckoned him to herself, as a distant, flickering campfire in the steppe beckons a traveler through the freezing, dark autumnal night. Now, as he returned from staff headquarters, he thought of Aksenia. We're going to try to break through, but what about her? Without hesitation, he decided, Natalia will stay behind with the children, with Mother, but I'll take Aksenia with me. I'll get her a horse, and she can ride with my staff. He crossed the Don to Bazki, entered his quarters, tore a page from his notebook and wrote, Aksenia, we may have to retreat to the left side of the Don. If so, leave everything and ride to Vyashenska. Look for me there. You will go with me. He folded the note and sealed it with gum, gave it to Prokhor Zhykov, and flushing, concealing his embarrassment under unnecessary sternness, told him, Ride to Tatarsk and give this note to Aksenia Astakhova. See that no one of my people notices you give it to her. Better take it at night. I don't need an answer. And afterwards you can have 2 days' furlough. Off with you. Prokhor turned to go for his horse, but Griagor called him back. Go to my hut and tell my mother or Natalia that they'd better send clothing and anything else of value over to this side of the Don. They can bury the grain, but the cattle had better be driven across to this side. Chapter 2. During the early days of June, the insurgent forces began to retire along the whole of the front. They retreated fighting, contesting every inch of ground. Before them, the inhabitants of the villages fled in panic towards the Don. The old men and the women harnessed up all the draft animals in their possession, and loaded their wagons with chests, utensils, and implements, grain, and children. The village herds were broken up, and the owners drove their cows and sheep along the roadside. Enormous trains of refugees rolled down to the Donside villages before the army. The women, dusty and black with sunburn, drove the cattle. The horsemen rode at the roadside. The creaking of wheels, snorting of horses and sheep, lowing of cows, crying of children, groans of the typhus sufferers also carried away in the flight, shattered the inviolate silence of the villages and the cherry orchards. So unusual was this myriad-toned, blended roar that the dogs went hoarse with barking, gave up flinging themselves at every passer-by, and no longer accompanied the wagons on their way for a good mile as in normal times. On the morning of June 4th, the sky was covered with a tenuous mist. Not a single cloud was visible over all its expanse, save where to the south, just before sunrise, a tiny, blindingly rosy little cloud appeared. The side of it, turned towards the east, seemed to be streaming with blood. The sun rose above the sandy breakers of the left bank of the river, and the cloud disappeared from sight. By noonday it was extraordinarily hot for early June. The air steamed as though before rain. From early dawn, the refugee wagons had been dragging along the right bank of the Don towards Vieszenska. The sound of cartwheels, of snorting horses, bellowing bullocks, and human voices floated across the river. Prokhor Zhykov handed Gregor's note to Aksenia, told Ilinichna Gregor's oral instructions, spent 2 days at home, and left for Vieszenska on the 4th of June. He expected to find his company in Bazki, but the heavy gunfire in the distance seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the river Chira. Prokhor felt no strong desire to ride to where a battle was raging, and he resolved to make his way to Bazki and wait there for Gregor and the 1st Division to arrive. He rode unhurriedly, almost at a walking pace, along the Hetman's highway to Gromok. He overtook the staff of a recently formed Ust-Khapiersk regiment and attached himself to it. The staff was traveling on light, springed drozhkis and a couple of wagonettes. On one of the wagonettes were documents and telephone apparatus. On the other, a wounded elderly Cossack and another hook-nosed man, terribly emaciated, his head covered with an officer's gray karakul fur cap. Evidently he was just recovering from typhus. He lay with a greatcoat covering him to his chin, yet he was asking someone to wrap his feet in something warm, and raged and cursed as he rubbed the sweat from his forehead with his bony hand. "You swine! The wind's getting under my feet. Polycarp, cover me with a rug. I must needs come down just when I was needed." His eyes wandered absently around him. The man he had called Polycarp dismounted and hurried to the wagonette. He said, "Why, as it is, you're so hot you'll catch a chill, Samoilo Ivanovitch." "Cover me up, I tell you." Polycarp obediently carried out the order and dropped back. "Who is he?" Prokhor asked him, with his eyes indicating the sick man. "An officer from Ust-Medvedets. He was attached to our staff," the Cossack replied. A swarm of refugees from Ust-Khapiersk villages was retreating with the staff. Prokhor called to one old Cossack who was seated on a wagon piled high with various domestic treasures. "Hey, where the devil do you think you're going?" "We're going to Vieszenska," the man replied. "Did they send for you to go to Vieszenska?" "No one sent for us, but who wants to meet his death? When fear looks in your eyes, you'll ride fast enough." "I asked you why you are going to Vieszenska," Prokhor demanded. "You could have crossed the Don at Yalanska and stayed there in the steppe on the other side for weeks. No, you must go to Vieszenska. But you don't know why. And what have you got all those for?" Prokhor irritably pointed his whip at the bundles on the wagon. "We've got our clothing and horse collars, flour and such like that we need on the farm. We couldn't leave them behind. We'd have come back to find our hut bare. My boy, when you've got your things together with tears and sweat, it isn't easy to leave them behind. If it had been possible, I'd have packed up my hut, too, so that the Reds shouldn't get it. The cholera seized them. But that great trough there, what are you dragging that with you for? And those chairs, the Reds wouldn't want them." "We couldn't leave them behind. They'd have broken them up or burned them. No, they won't get rich at my expense. I cleaned the hut right out." The old man waved his whip at the wearily plodding horses, turned and pointed with the stock at a bullock wagon behind him, and added, "You see that girl wrapped up there driving the bullocks? She's my daughter. She's got a pig with a litter of little ones in that wagon. The pig had them during the night as she lay in the wagon. Can you hear the little ones squealing?
No, the Reds won't get very fat at my expense, the plague take them. Keep clear of me when you get to the ferry, Grandad, Prokhor remarked, or you and your pigs and all your possessions will go overboard into the Don. What for? The old man asked in blank amazement. Because people are dying and losing everything, and you old devil, are dragging everything with you like a spider, the usually peaceable Prokhor shouted. I don't like dung-eaters like you. He touched up his horse and trotted on. Behind him, the thin, piercing scream of a little pig suddenly rose over the other sounds. What the devil is that? The officer lying in the wagonette shouted, frowning and all but weeping. Where's that pig come from? Polycarp! It's a pig fallen from a wagon, and the wheel went over its leg, Polycarp informed him. Tell the owner of the pig to cut its throat. Tell him there are sick men here. That's hard enough, and then we have that scream. Hurry up! Prokhor, who had drawn level with the wagonette, saw the officer listening with knitted brows to the scream, and vainly trying to cover his ears with his gray cap. Polycarp rode up again. He doesn't want to kill it, Samoilo Ivanovich. He says it'll get better, and if not, they'll kill it this evening. The officer went pale, struggled to raise himself, and sat up, dangling his legs over the side of the wagonette. Where's my revolver? Stop the horse. Where's the owner of that pig? I'll show him. Which wagon is he on? He exclaimed, and the thrifty old Cossack was compelled to cut the pig's throat. Prokhor rode off laughing, and soon overtook a new long line of Ust-Hapiersk wagons. There were not less than 200 of them, and with their horsemen, cattle, and sheep, they stretched for nearly a mile along the road. There'll be a fine scene at the ferry, Prokhor thought. From the head of the line, a woman riding a handsome dark bay horse galloped to meet him. As she came up to him, she reined in her horse. She was seated in a richly ornamented saddle. The girths and seat gleamed with good, almost unscratched leather. The snaffles and metal parts glittered with silver. The woman sat the saddle intelligently and easily. She held the reins correctly in her strong, swarthy hand, but it was evident that the well-grown military mount was contemptuous of his mistress. He rolled his eyes, arched his neck, and laying bare the yellow line of teeth, tried to bite the woman's knee, showing beneath her skirt. She was wrapped to her eyes with a clean blue kerchief. Removing it from her lips, she asked Prokhor, Daddy, you haven't passed wagons with wounded on them, have you? I've passed lots of wagons, but what of it? Why, I can't find my husband, the woman slowly replied. He was wounded in the leg, and he's being brought from Ust-Hapiersk by a field hospital. But it seems the wound has festered, and he told me to bring him his horse. This is the horse. The woman patted the animal's neck. I saddled the horse and rode to Ust-Hapiersk, but I couldn't find the hospital. And I've ridden and ridden, but I can't find him. Admiring the Cossack woman's full, handsome face, Prokhor listened contentedly to the soft timbre of her low contralto voice and exclaimed, Why, woman, what do you want to look for your husband for? Let him go with the field hospital. Anyone would marry such a beauty as you with a horse like that for dowry. I'd risk it myself. The woman smiled reluctantly and bent to draw the edge of her skirt over her knee. Tell me without any of your jokes, have you passed a field hospital? She demanded. You'll find sick and wounded in that group there, Prokhor answered with a sigh, pointing at the line of wagons some distance behind. The woman waved her whip, sharply turned her horse, and cantered off. The wagons moved along slowly. The bullocks lazily waved their tails, driving off the buzzing horseflies. It was so hot, so stifling and sultry was the air with its menace of thunder, that the young leaves of the sunflowers growing by the wayside were wilting. Once more Prokhor rode alongside a string of wagons. He was astonished at the large number of young Cossacks with them, men who must either have been separated or else have deserted from their companies, had joined their families, and were riding with them to the river crossing. Some of them had tied their army horses behind the wagons and were lying talking with their wives or nursing children. Others rode on horseback, fully armed with swords and rifles. "They've left their detachments and are fleeing," Prokhor decided as he stared at them. The bullocks moved slowly, sullenly. From their protruding tongues, strings of spittle hung down to the very dust. The wagons, drawn by horses, moved at the same pace, making no attempt to pass. The entire band was traveling at not more than 3 or 4 miles an hour. But suddenly there was the sound of gunfire in the distance to the south, and the cavalcade immediately came to life. The wagons, drawn by 1 or 2 horses, turned out of the line. The horses were put into a trot. Knouts began to whistle. Shouts arose. The willow switches hissed over the bullocks' backs. The wheels clattered faster. In their alarm, all accelerated their pace. Heavy clouds of dust rose in dense billows from the road and floated back, settling on the stalks of grain and grasses. Prokhor's own little horse had been dragging towards the grass, putting its nose down and tearing up bunches of clover, rape, and field mustard. But when the gunfire broke out, Prokhor dug his heels into its flanks, and, as though understanding that now was not the moment for feeding, the animal willingly broke into a jog trot. The cannonade grew in intensity. The sharp crack of rifle shots mingled with its shattering octave to send a rolling, thunderous roar through the salty air. "Lord Jesus!" a young woman riding on a wagon crossed herself, tore her brown nipple, glistening with milk, from her infant's mouth, and thrust her swollen yellow breast into her shirt. "Is that our men firing, or who, soldier?" an old man, striding along by his bullocks, shouted to Prokhor. "It's the Reds, Daddy. Our guns haven't got any shells." "Queen of Heaven save them." The man let the reins fall from his hand, removed his old Cossack cap, and crossed himself as he walked, turning his face to the east. In the south an oily black cloud ascended from behind a rise. It extended over all the horizon, and the sky was hidden behind its misty pall. "Look, there's a big fire back there," someone shouted. "What can it be? Where is it burning?" voices asked above the rattle of the cartwheels. "It's along the Chira River. It's the Reds burning the villages along the Chira." "God forbid!" "Look what a great cloud of smoke there is. That's more than 1 village on fire." "Ivan, tell them in front to hurry up." The pall of black smoke extended over more and more of the sky. The roar of gunfire grew steadily louder. Within half an hour the southerly wind brought to the hetman's highway the pungent and alarming scent of villages burning along the Chira, some 20 miles away. In one spot, the road to Gramok passed by an enclosure fenced with gray blocks of stone, then turned sharply towards the Don, dropping into a shallow gully across which a log bridge was thrown. In dry weather, the bottom of the gully gleamed yellow with sand and colorful pebbles. But after a summer rain, the muddy floods of rainwater sped furiously down the hill, and a stream ran along the gully, washing and rolling over the stones, roaring down to the Don. On such days the bridge was submerged, but not for long. The transient hill water, which at its height would break down walls and root up fences with their posts, quickly abated, and the pebbles gleamed freshly again on the bottom of the gully. The sides of the gully were densely grown with willows and poplars. In their shade it was cool, even on the hottest days of the summer. Rejoicing in the cool, an outpost of Vyazhenska militia, numbering 11 men, was stationed by the bridge, with instructions to arrest all Cossacks of military age attempting to make their way to Vyazhenska. Until the first refugee wagons appeared in the distance, the men lay under the bridge, playing cards, smoking, some of them undressing and freeing their shirts and pants of the insatiable soldiers' lice. 2 of them obtained permission from their officer and went off to bathe in the Don.